Hey everybody, it's Austin here, doing an episode of Giant Bomb Presents with Jonathan Blow.
Hi.
And also joining us, Jeff Bakalar.
Hello.
Who you know from the Giant Beastcast. Jeff and I just got finished playing The Witness for the last hour and a half or so.
Yes.
It was an interesting and I think fun. We had a lot of fun solving puzzles together.
We had a lot of fun.
And we also had lots of talks generally about the shape of what The Witness is,
right.
The place of puzzle games like this, and some broader philosophical discussions. And so I'm happy to be able to talk with you, Jonathan,
right.
about the game and about, what it is you're kind of aiming for here.
Sure.
How has the response been so far?
It's been great. I mean, you never really know, though, because, I don't know, I sort of learned early on that it's hard to judge how people really feel about something based on how they interact. I think that's true for anything, right?
Yeah.
So, it looks like it's been great. Like, everybody seems to really like the game, which is kind of surprising because it's a weird game, right?
Yeah.
So you would sort of expect that you bring it around and some people are like, oh, I really didn't like it at all, but I see how someone could be interested.
And
I haven't even ever got that response.
Right, by not getting that response, you're now kind of like doubting the general response. Because,
well, it's a little bit, when we come to stuff like this, we at least try to aim and like pick people who aren't going to totally hate this genre of game. So it's
Sure.
a little bit self-selected, but just anytime you make something weird, you have to expect that not everybody's going to love it, right?
Sure.
So, but it's been doing great in terms of just we bring it to people and
their response has been positive. Yeah. So for people who aren't familiar, it's a game that kind of my first thought of it was it reminded me of something like Myst. Here's an island. There are mysterious things on this island. There are a set of puzzles.
Right.
Unlike Myst, those puzzles are a lot more clear. Right. It's like, oh, here is a screen. That is a maze. Those mazes can have different rule sets. We came across 5 or 6 different types of maze. Like, obviously, the one is just like, oh, you start here, the end is here.
Right.
From there, it becomes more complicated because it can be things like, oh, but before you reach the end, you have to go over these certain marked spaces, or you're controlling 2 kind of lines at once that are mirroring each other or in symmetry in some way, but the maze is different for them. There's a bunch of different things like that. I don't want to give too many of those away, though. And one of the things that we always liked, I think, Jeff, I think this is true, is like, what is this puzzle? Like, how do we even do this? And then...
Well, we found that playing through that there's always some kind of, logical evolutionary sort of path where you never are presented with something, aside from maybe one part where we're like, oh,
yeah,
everything we've learned up until here hasn't, gotten us to the point where we don't know how to...
Or we would see a puzzle where it's like, or I don't want to do this one, but that must mean that there is somewhere else in the vicinity a puzzle that will teach us the rules of this.
Right.
Thing.
That information is here somewhere.
Right. For the most part, again, we hit one puzzle that we couldn't quite work out. We thought we knew the rules.
I mean, that's always true for everything.
Sure.
Sometimes you really need to go somewhere very far, right?
So the island has a kind of, just to set it up again for people, like, we ran into 30 or 40 puzzles, maybe more, maybe a handful less, but
more,
dozens and dozens of them. And for the most part, it seems like you're alone on the island. There are some kind of, I don't want to say creepy, but there's like a kind of an abandoned town early on, or a little village.
It sort of seems like something happened.
That's the feel we get.
And now everyone's gone.
Right. So that's the setup. Like, that's what that game is. That's our experience of the game so far.
Yeah.
What was, given kind of pitch of the game, is that the sort of thing you expect to hear people describe the game as, given an hour and a half with
right.
it?
I mean, when I started the game, it was sort of an homage to Myst and that series of games, which, if you're going to describe it, taking out the mechanics part, it's just like, look, you're alone on an island and trying to figure out what's going on, However, right, the way that this game was designed was also looking back to those, not only as positive examples, but also negative examples, because like the adventure game genre kind of mostly died out, and they used to be my favorite kind of game, and I think there are good reasons why it died out, right? So part of what I was doing was saying, if I was going to make one of these games today...
Which you are, I guess.
Which I am. What would it be like, right? And how would I change it, so that's sort of what you have. But that description that you started with is definitely the aim.
what's the difficulty in designing a set of puzzles like these where we do wander onto something that is overwhelming in some cases, or so sometimes we hit one puzzle, which was just to give you a little hint. There's a sequence where you realize that the puzzles can refer to things beyond the screen.
Yeah.
It's not just the markers.
Yeah.
There's other stuff
Right.
in the environment that
Let's not spoil that too hard.
Sure.
There's a couple different places.
But
you
we hit a
can
point
talk
where it
about
was like
it.
we hit a point where it was like, okay, I don't know what the solution is here.
Okay.
And
And it was in a chain of things where we thought we had figured out
hit the
pattern.
first two successfully.
Right, yeah.
And
And you seem like you know exactly which one.
I think so.
yeah, okay. So part of me as a player,
Yeah.
and this is a kind of a broader question, I would bat my head against that thing for the next hour until I brute force it, and that's bad. I don't know that I'm the every player here, but because I hit those first two, I'm either going to end up leaving that space frustrated. It's like I thought I understood the rules to this thing, because it's not communicating to me that I'm missing something necessarily. And we got to a point where we were talking about, like, did something change here historically?
Yeah.
Like, did something happen in this space to make me not be able to understand what's happening here?
Yeah, like, is this a result of, like,
Some
a story where something broke right here?
And so how do you address someone like me, or not like me, but in general, a player who might find that frustrating thing? How do you ease them into saying, listen, you have a whole puzzle filled, or a whole island filled with puzzles. Just go elsewhere.
I think that thing that you're saying already happens in the construction of the game, right? Like, it's a very different situation from a linear game where you have no choice but to solve this thing, right? Or you just can't play the game anymore, and that kind of sucks, right? So here, at least, if you get stuck, there's a bunch of different ways people can get stuck, right? They could have no idea. They could think they could be pretty confident they have the idea, but they're actually wrong, and that's even worse, right? Because you'll just bite your head off a long time. But what you do is you provide a lot of different opportunities, right? And then somewhere else in the world, because everything is so interrelated, some other puzzle that you find may give you a new perspective on the thing that you were working on.
Right, and I think we had a few examples of that happen.
Totally. Again, that was the majority. The last experience I talked about was the very minority.
Yeah.
So, like, mostly I think it worked. But
even when someone has that kind of experience, that is actually okay.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's the kind of thing that a lot of game designers will freak when that happens, and they do the focus test, and people get stuck, and they're like, "Oh my god, we have to change our game." Right. The problem is, the world is full of a lot of different people, and different people will get stuck on different things.
Sure.
And if you hammer out every single thing out of your game that might get somebody stuck, you end up with a really bland game. And I
sand
think
it off all
happens
the
a lot.
edges that are actually kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and so what I do is I do the opposite thing. When you guys come out of the tutorial area, right? You probably saw this big vault door that's off there to the left. And usually when people see it, they're not really ready to do it yet. And then the information to do it is just, I know you saw it because there's something else that you said.
Okay.
So,
yes.
this is deliberately presented. We aim the path sort of up and then down toward it before it goes on. So people are meant to see it and approach it if they're interested in it, and not be able to solve it. And that's the first real puzzle in the game.
I know.
The other ones are a little lighter.
There are other mazes, but that is the first one that requires you to put together information from a bunch of different spaces.
Yeah, and so it's deliberately unsolvable to sort of non-verbally communicate. Like, look, this may happen once in a while, and it's okay. You just move on, and in that case, if you move on 30 feet, and you're perceptive, you can see the information that you're bring back, right? And so I designed that way. So the thing, it's also an interesting question of when you interrupt people and ask them how things are going, right? So, a lot of the time, if you watch people and they're frustrated in the middle of something, right? But then they eventually overcome the problem, right? The feeling of victory is often bigger, and the way human memory works, that's actually a positive experience in retrospect, right? And so if you freak about something like that as a designer, you may be disabling a very positive experience, actually.
Because you kind of numbed the feeling of success because there wasn't such a problem to begin with.
However, all that is only true if people are getting stuck for a relatively good. If the game is fair, for example, if the game's kind of unfair and it's like asking you to solve a cat hair mustache puzzle,
That's the one.
You don't get
That's
it,
the one. Yeah.
you know, that's not good, right? So everything I'm saying has to be taken in a certain light. The designer still has to be very careful about what they put in the game.
So how do you do that without? So you know the cat hair mustache puzzle is like a famous like death of adventure games puzzle.
Yes.
But I you ask like why does that happen? Like what happened there? And I've always thought about that moment as this very strange, almost like an arms race for absurdity and what people thought at the time was comedy in adventure game design. And it was bad.
It's that combined with loss of perspective.
Totally.
Because to design that puzzle, you have to have no idea what it looks like to the player when they're walking up.
So then, how do you? But where that came from for me, or it's both of those things. It's this notion of like, oh, our puzzles have to be. They can't be mazes. Our puzzles have to be. They have to have personality of some sort or a human element in some weird bad way.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating for more cat hair mustaches.
Thank you.
That character didn't even didn't have a mustache in the idea to begin with. So I know it's terrible. But how do you appeal to those people who are like, oh, but I come to adventure games for personality? When what you're saying, well, when they look at the game for the first time, they hear, oh, there's like 50 hours of mazes in this game.
So there actually was going to be more of that in this game initially, right? I was going to do like audio logs in the classic fashion where there's some character speaking directly at you as you go through. And eventually those have been taken out and they've been replaced by some things that you saw a little bit of that are more like flavor in the background that hint at the plot of what's going on. But there's not like a direct character relationship anymore because for a lot of reasons I did that, right? But when I decided that, I was very conscious of this thing that you're saying about, some people want
personality, something,
right?
character.
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Some people like story more than the other part. And, well, every game's different. And for this game, it just wasn't right to make it very much about story. There still is a story, right? It's just very backgrounded. So, I'm not Activision, right? I didn't spend $500 million on this game, so I don't have to sell it to every person on the earth. I only have to sell it to people who are interested in it,
right?
In theory.
Are you bringing the same notion of so earlier moments ago we were talking about how puzzle design can be such, or kind of the meta structure of the puzzle design can be such that frustration is part of an overall long-term joy, long-term pleasure. The narrative design is similar in that respect, where obviously I don't think the end of this game is a solution to the meaning of life. Right? I'm not going to walk away. But given what we've seen so far, and I don't want to get too specific here because
those feels like it's going to be a commentary on that.
Right. Are you as interested or are you as willing to give dead ends narratively that are, or may you even be more willing to give narrative dead ends in the way that like I could spend hours of this game feeling like I don't know what its philosophy or ethos is, in the same way that I could spend hours of this game not knowing how to move past a certain puzzle.
Maybe a little bit, but I will say the idea of what the game's about does sort of build progressively over a long time, provided that you dig up the things that hint at that, right? And so it's not meant to be a puzzle in the same way as the puzzles in the game, but it is meant to be very interesting and something that people really may actually really care about, as opposed to many games, almost all game stories, which are kind of patterned after, for some reason. So you can imagine stories in games. The tradition maybe is inherited. The habits we have come from other media earlier than games. For some reason, almost all our habits come from Hollywood movies. Yeah. I don't know why that happened, but it did. They don't come from great novels, right? They don't come from epic poetry. Sure. They don't come from stage plays, right? And one of the very bad things about, in my opinion, about Hollywood, right? I'm not a Hollywood insider, but as someone who goes and sees movies, I have this problem with them. Basically, most movies since the 80s are not really about what they say they're about. They're more about pretending to be about what they say they're about. So let's take a movie that's relatively serious, like a movie that's about a guy who's divorced and trying to be a good father, right? You go and see that movie, and I don't even have a specific movie in mind.
Right.
This is just a random thing, but you go and see that movie, and what it's really doing is like going through a series of steps of first we're getting you to empathize with the character, and then we're exhibiting the relationship between him and his son, and then we're going to cause a problem, right? It's like, it's just going through some motions. It's not really about anything but going through the motions, right? It's about fitting a structure.
It's to prepare you to not be surprised by the actions of the characters.
Right.
Yeah,
Totally.
Which, there is an element of storytelling skill there that's actually important.
Right, it's like the classic horror trope of like the actual horror isn't the killer with the knife. It's that we're all approachable in our own homes. That we're all always vulnerable or something.
Yeah.
Right. That's like when it works right. That functions in that way.
But anyway, so what I'm trying to get at is I go see movies like that, and they all feel fake. Like even the supposedly arty movies usually feel very fake. Action movie, you don't even expect that out of an action movie, right? But and so somehow when you see a story in a game, it's kind of the same thing. It's totally inherited that mode of storytelling. So you see a game, and it's ostensibly about. I don't know. We don't even try that hard in games, but it's about some serious subject, and then you play it, and it's more like lip service to that serious subject. And this is going on a long discourse.
Sure.
But I just want to say that I tried very, very hard not to fall into those habits. So this game is about things that I actually really care about, and it's the way that the story elements are presented are in a way that I agonized over for years to figure out exactly the right way to do it. Which is why, when I said there used to be a more direct, talking to a character kind of thing, I took that out because it was a little too fake for what was really trying to go on in the game.
Do you think that I think there's a lot here to work through and unpack.
Yeah.
I think it would be really easy to move on to a new topic.
Sure.
But I think it's actually worth digging in a little bit here.
For sure.
Which is so a couple things. One. We'll take this one at a time, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's any value in presenting something that is you didn't use the word pretentious there when describing Hollywood film, but the notion of it wants or other game stories where they're saying, and I don't mean pretentious in the way that I think most of us hear it used in our Twitter feed.
But that's why I didn't use the word.
Right. But in a way that is what you're actually saying, which
the
is
literal definition of pretentious is what I mean.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the action movie or the action game that says that it wants to be about camaraderie or something is actually just about a power fantasy, right? Like that the actual
or not
is
even that.
shooting things.
It's also about pretending to be about camaraderie.
Right, totally. Is there then any value in the action movie that doesn't pretend to be an action? It doesn't pretend to be more than a movie about.
Totally. I mean, in fact, it's better when you don't do that.
So in that case, is honesty the thing that you're looking for in art right now?
It's one of several things,
Okay.
and I think it's very important. I mean, I like action movies when they're good.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen The Raid and The Raid 2. Those are good movies,
and they know what they are. Is what you're saying? You think?
Yeah, they go a little bit too much into that territory of pretending to be about drama. Also, I think. But if you just ignore that part of those movies and just say look, this is some action.
Yeah.
Then.
Well, that was a lot of the thing for Mad
Yeah.
Max or something like that.
Yeah.
Or I thought at least, where that was something that was just not pretending to be something it wasn't.
You know, pretty straightforward.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, but what caught me interestingly enough about what you're talking about with getting telling a story in a game.
Yeah.
You have cutscenes that seem to just bridge the story along, and then when you're playing, you're just playing this game that every move you make, every action in a game doesn't necessarily take a narrative sort of toll on the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this is attempting to turn that on its head, where it's no. When you're moving around, that's what in fact is telling a story, as opposed to unlocking a cutscene.
Right.
So here's the thing, right? People are listening to the podcast and they're like, well, if the story's way in the background, how can something interesting keep your mind occupied, right? Because most games use the story as a way to keep pulling you through the game because you want to know what happens next, right? And so obviously, if I'm going to put that more in the background, something has to be there, right? And in this game, it's the ideas in the gameplay, right? Are they make sequences of ideas. Like I think of it as like a stream of nonverbal communication, where you're not just solving some arbitrary puzzles that are just hard to solve or whatever. They all have ideas behind them, and the ideas make patterns that you follow, right? So it's got some of like the structure and flow that a story has, but it's not a story. It's more.
It's
like
not a story in the way we talk about stories.
Right, right. But it's also very complicated. Like even by the end of the hour and a half that you guys played, if you were to try to explain to someone who walked in, like what are the what is this all about?
Yeah.
If you were to try to explain it in every detail, it would be a long explanation.
Yeah.
You know? So
In that way,
that's
there
interesting
is-
to me, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's not a thing that game designers usually try to do. And so as part of what this game is about is zooming in on that capability.
So that's another thing here. So going back again to this notion of honesty and stuff, and pretension by the literal definition. Do you think that you're doing this here is something novel, or do you think that when those other games are kind of missing what they really are, is that a misstep in the element of creation elsewhere? Do you know what I mean? So in the same way that let's talk about Hollywood, because it's probably easier to talk about Hollywood.
Sure.
But when Michael Bay makes a movie. I mean, Michael Bay's probably a bad example because he might be the most honest filmmaker in Hollywood, even though I actually don't love his films, but I think that, you know what I mean. When a director makes a movie that's supposed to be about family, but really it's about some other things, but it's about wanting to be a movie about family, is that there is a disconnect in this level of craft that's happening from the director and the writer and the acting? Is that a lack of knowledge? Is that a technological fault? What is an overdetermined thing where a bunch of different things are happening?
There's just all kinds of things going on, I think. Wow, it's got loud out
I know,
there.
sorry, I apologize. It's not coming through too bad on the mic.
There's all kinds of things going on. I can't really speak to like why Hollywood people make the specific movies they do, but it's probably mostly money issues, right? If you want to get a movie funded, it has to be a certain thing.
It's going to appeal to check those boxes.
Right, does the acquisition thing again.
Which is not an unreasonable thing to expect. I mean, $100 million is a lot of money or something, right?
But is that what's separating it from honesty? Is the budget?
I think so, to a large degree. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be honest, you risk a lot, right? You risk not being appealing, for one, right? And so I think that, and I'm not even saying that that's a bad thing that these budgets cause this. It's like what's to be like I'm a game designer.
Yeah.
Game designers are people who design systems and understand how systems behave as they move on under their own governance, right? And so if you look at the system that we have, it's pretty obvious that you have these expensive things that people want to see, and therefore the creation of them is going to be very risk averse. That happens in every industry where there's expensive products. So I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying, though, that I personally, as a creator, would like to do something different from that. Yeah. So,
what led you to that point? There's I think a lot about the study of ideology, the study of any art form. There often are these moments where there's a sea change and things move in a different direction, or you find someone who says like, "Oh, look at how the world is ideological, but I'm in a position because of XYZ where I can see that ideology is functioning, and because I can see it." So what life experiences, or what experiences as a designer, or what influences led you to the position now where you're saying like, I'm going to try to make an honest game?
Well, for me, it's not that analytical. It's just I'm just doing how I feel about things, and I can't pin it to one cause, right? I mean, Braid was trying to be an honest game in a different way.
Do you think it succeeded?
Mostly.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly. More than people give it credit for, I'll say that. But this game is very different from that, right? Because I'm finding just different ways to do things. And every game is different, and every game has different requirements about what... Like, the ideas and the gameplay of the game sort of have different things that they need to make them effective, right? If I was making a shooter, it would be really different.
Right.
So, at the point now, I feel like I've done a good job of making this game honest, which may be different from the things that I would need to do to make it make the most money.
Sure.
Like, that is just how it is. So, I think it'll be very successful. Like I said, people like it, but...
What's the insulation that you have? I'm not... I'm just really am curious about the process here, because like if this is your concern, what is your insulation from making a game that wants to appear to be honest instead of making
it's
an honest
hard.
game?
It's very easy to slip over that line.
Yeah.
Very easy, right? And just for me, it's some feeling of dissatisfaction that slowly boils over, and then I have to figure out what I'm dissatisfied with and why, and sometimes that takes a long time even, you know. Like with the way that the story happens in the game, I thought for years that it was going to be the other version, and I kept trying different ways of doing it, and I was like, oh, this sucks, and this sucks, and I don't, you know, and I was slowly honing in on why I thought it all sucked. And it was just, there was a fundamental incompatibility between that idea and what I wanted to do. So, I mean, that's not a new story. It's just, you know, sometimes people who make things have an internal compass that they follow that tells them what to make, and it's just that.
This is what it is. Yeah, this is regardless of if it's well received or not. Like that, is that a fear of yours that people have spent so much time playing games that appear to be something else, or that convince them that they're this other thing, that now faced with this, that they won't?
Well, I mean, rationally that should be the fear, but in reality, I mean, people love the game so far, you know, and again, I can't extrapolate that to the audience of everyone in the world, but at least enough people really love it that there's going to be plenty of people who like the game when it comes out. Like it'll be successful in that degree, right? But also besides that, even just on the internal compass standpoint, I mean, it's the best thing that I've ever made by a substantial margin. I think it's a way better game than Braid was, and Braid was well received. And so, you know, times are a little different now.
Yeah,
Times are a little different, but this is also a much bigger, bulkier game as well. So we have to see how it's received, but I feel very good about it. And
how do you think things have changed in the time since Braid? And for you also as a designer, but for the industry and for games as we think and talk about them?
Well, it's interesting because AAA hasn't changed that much, actually. Most of the change has been at the low end. AAA's changed a little because there's fewer of those games now than there used to be, just because they're more expensive or whatever. You know, on the independent side, obviously, it's not really news that there's more independent games than ever, and it's harder for individual games to get attention just because people only have so much time to play games, right? And so my strategy about that, I mean, it's been my strategy even before this became the market conditions, but if I can go to somebody and say, look, this game is really different than anything else that you've played, and I've worked very hard to make this the best experience that I could, I think that's the most you could ever say to someone if you're trying to give them a game. And the more straightforwardly and honestly you can say that and not be some kind of bullshit like I'm trying to sell you snake oil, then the better it works. And so I believe that hopefully... So at the same time, you know, while there's all these more games, there's also a much bigger audience. Like I was telling someone yesterday, when Braid came out on Steam, which was a little bit after it came out on Live Arcade, like the max simultaneous people for Steam was like 1.4 million or something in 2009, and now it's 10 times that or something, right? There's a much bigger potential audience than there was, and so I think that's quite not... You just... As a developer, it is harder, though, because you have to make it into like the top small percentage of people, of games that people actually pay attention to.
When people say you're getting that feedback that people like what they've played so far, what's been standing out that is...
Well, it's just the size and complexity of the game, you know, and the fact that it's all high quality all the way through and that everything's original, I think. So... Again, you know, games, it's a very coarse way to think about a game is like how many hours is it, right? Sure. But it's a measurement, it's one of the only objective measurements.
Right.
It's not really that objective.
The running time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people take different amounts of time to play things, especially a puzzle game.
Yeah. Especially if Jeff is next to me and we're moving way faster than we just by myself.
With two people, you know, one person gets stuck, but the other person sees it, so you can go. But, you know, I think of Braid as being a 5-hour game, roughly. You know, some people do it in 4, maybe 3.5. Some people do it in 10 because, you know, they get stuck or whatever. The Witness, by that same measurement, is about a 100-hour game. So People could probably do it in 75 if they're fast, and that's for completionists, right? There's a minimal win that you can do that's half or a third of that, let's say, right? But it's still a big game with a lot of stuff in it, right?
Is that half or a third point? This phrase that we keep coming back to. There was a post earlier this year on Steam. There's a user who was responding to Her Story, a game by Sam Barlow, who wrote, how do I know when I'm done this game? And someone said, you're done when you feel satisfied. And this person responded, how do I know when I'm satisfied? Right? Which is a great, how do I know what satisfaction feels like?
Yeah.
How do you respond to that with your game? If I get 50 hours in or 60 hours in and reach a minimal end, 75 hours in, one, how do I know that? Is that really clear? Two, how do you encourage me to keep playing?
Well, yeah, I think it's clear that there's an ending and that there's also more, right? We try to, it's also, again, I'm trying to be honest with the game, so it's not a feel-good ending where we do fireworks and say, good job, like in Peggle or whatever, play Ode to Joy. We don't do that. And I'm still refining the finer points of it as well. But it's usually obvious that there's more stuff because, hey, there's stuff way back that I know I should solve, right?
Yeah.
And so if
that damn rock.
If people want to go back and load their save game and find that stuff, they're totally free to do it. And then the more they find, just the deeper they'll go into understanding what the game's about and stuff. Yeah,
I know this is a very this is going to be maybe kind of a ridiculous question, but obviously the main puzzle element is this sort of maze style where you're tracing, with the thumbsticks and so.
Yeah.
I wonder, how that became the language of this game.
That's not a stupid question.
Why?
It isn't.
Not that it's stupid, just a loaded question, maybe.
Part of that is a massive, massive spoiler, right? So
that's what I'm saying, because we talked a little bit about how playing the game is more the story than waiting for a cutscene to finish. So,
but once I had an idea in that ballpark, right? Then there's some kind of fine-tuning about what can we make that's very, very simple that also lets us do a lot of things with it, right? Because the game, so people see the trailer or something, especially the first trailer, and they're like, it's a game about drawing some lines and some mazes. How is that possibly interesting?
Or 100 hours.
or 10 hours, right?
Yeah,
how is it possibly 2 hours, right? How is it not stupid? And the reason it's not stupid is because that is actually a tool for taking you on a trip through this space of ideas. And it's the different ideas that are interesting. And there's really a lot of them, and there's no filler, right? So even, sometimes you'll find a set of puzzles and it'll proceed by smaller steps and then it'll take bigger steps, but there's always a step of some size, right? And your brain picks up on that. You're like, oh yeah, I get what's happening, right? And so the design of the game was about making all these areas that explore the different possible ideas in as much detail as is interesting, which is often a lot of detail.
Without repeating.
Yeah, without repeating. Often things cross-reference each other.
Right, sure.
Stuff,
right. Yeah.
But always there's something new. And then, there's that flow, right? What keeps you going through the game is that kind of flow. But then there's also... sometimes there are big surprises. Like, oh my god, I never thought that the ideas would go to this place, but now that they have, I totally see how it makes sense. Right? There's a bunch of things like that. So I forgot what the original question was.
It was more like
why mazes?
Why the maze?
Yeah,
why
is the maze okay. So part of it is because it made that possible. It's a relatively blank slate, right? That then we could go because. And the other thing it does is it removes ambiguity. So, I really enjoyed the Myst games back when they came out and other games. I used to love Infocom's text adventures. But all those games have serious problems by modern standards, right? So you go to another genre of game, like a fighting game, right? There's a flow to a fighting game. Like, as a player, I'm doing a certain thing. I'm, looking for openings, I'm blocking, I'm doing my button reflexes and whatever. Same for an RTS, same for a racing game. They all have their different flavor, right? Adventure games never really found an analogous thing. I mean, even factor out the fact that they're not action-y, right? It's like, what is the flow of an adventure game? It's sort of supposed to be like, I'm figuring stuff out, right? But by amount of time that you spend playing an adventure game, it's almost 0% of what actually happens for those old games.
Right.
You spend a lot of time being confused. Like, why doesn't the parser understand what I'm trying to type? God damn it! The word's right there on the screen. I'm trying to pick up this thing that it says is on the screen, and it doesn't.
Am I ever going to use this glove that I have in my inventory that I've had for 2 hours?
Well, that's a little more legitimate, but it's still. Or you go to like a point and click game, and it's like I'm hunting all the pixels.
Right.
Is this active? Is this active? Oh, I'm stuck on a puzzle. But I have all these inventory items, so I'm going to drag them onto each
One
other
by one,
to
see if they ever match up.
And that's not gameplay, right? That just sucks. It's it's sort of gameplay, but it's not very good. So I was looking for a way to get rid of most of that stuff, right? So you wander around this environment now, and you see a puzzle panel, and it's a very clear signal. There is something here to figure out, right? And early in the game, you may even think that you know exactly what kind of thing, but then as you guys have seen, there's some curveballs even relatively early, right? So there's something to figure out, but sometimes you don't know exactly what connections to make, but you know also how to tell the computer that you figured it out. You have to draw the right line on the thing. So all the UI parts are now no longer confusing, And we also, people are in that yard at the beginning of the game until they trace a few panels, and that's partially getting people used to the controls, but it's also sort of saying, this is the kind of thing that you do. Like you solve one of these, you maybe follow the cable to see where it goes. So you use some, use your skills of observation on the environment, right? But we don't have you like twiddling knobs on a bunch of weird machines and whatever, right? So hopefully by the time people get out of there, they're sort of in the habit that they don't need to do that.
Right. They've internalized what the flow of that game is.
I think people will always like misclick like that because they'll see something interesting. But for the most part, then when you click it and it's not interactive, you're like, of course it's not. Nothing in this game has been. And we're also very careful about environment design to try not to make things that are interactive, which is a fun way to manage an art team because they always want to make cool looking stuff.
I actually just read a really great piece by someone on the team. It was on Kama Sutra this week.
Oh yeah, that was actually one of the architects.
Which
is external to our company. Worked on the game quite a lot.
What was that experience like to bring an architect on? And also in general, if you would just people talk a lot about like, oh, it's Jonathan Blow's new game, and like
a lot of people have worked on it actually.
Right.
It's not
so
like
can
I
you speak
made it
about what that
out
was?
Right. With my bare hands.
In your basement.
So we've got at this point we've got about 7 full-time people on our team, which is small. Very, very small compared to a AAA game, but it's starting to get big for an indie team because
for a 100-hour game. Also,
it's a huge game for a small team to make. That's why it took a long time, right? So we also work with various other people. So architects, we worked with 4 or 5 different people, 2 different architecture firms with a couple people each to design buildings and landscapes. And then sound, there's a sound team that is external, right? We work with them. It's Wabi Sabi Sound, who are the people who did sound for Dead Space, for example. They're very good. I actually wish we had brought a better sound system than this TV because the sound is amazing, but... and then a few other external people who do that kind of a thing. So, like, if you count the maximum number of people at once who are ever working on the game, it's maybe like 13 or 14.
What was that like in terms of like because there's a tension here that I'm seeing, which is or maybe not a tension, it's a tension, which is I think you have a notion of what an honest adventure game looks like.
Yes,
and it is your vision for this game.
Yes,
and my suspicion is that when someone else makes an adventure game, they think that they are making an honest adventure game. Not always,
maybe,
but I think that other people have made that. I've heard that sort of language used before.
Sure,
and I don't doubt that their intention. Maybe they're missing the ways in which they're deceiving.
I honestly can't say because I haven't talked to any designers about that specifically.
Sure.
So
okay, but my question is, how do you manage that desire, which is like I think I understand what an honest adventure game is, and that honesty needs to be communicated in this very complex way, where everything this is why you went to an architecture firm, right? Sure. It's like part of what Deanna says. Deanna Van Buren in this piece is like, BioShock Infinite had some very wonderful spaces, but they weren't cohesive in a way that respected the material that was actually being used there, and because of that, those spaces didn't communicate as much as they could have about the world and about the experiences and blah blah blah. And I think here, like yeah, of course, if you're going to make a game that's supposed to be honest about things in this way, where it isn't pretending to be something it isn't, that makes a lot of sense. But how do you deal with having to work with other people when what your idea of what an honest game is like in your head?
Well, it depends on who it is. Like for the architects, they have not worked on professional video games before, so there's a lot of communication that has to happen even before we get to that part.
Right.
Like, what is gameplay? And how do you design a building around gameplay? Which is not like, if I had just said design some buildings go and come back 2 years later, they'd be way different from what's actually in the game.
Right.
So there was just a long communication process there. With other people on the team who are familiar with games, but not this kind of game, early on there was a lot of discussion and reiteration of the same points from slightly different angles, and not even always about making the game honest, although that comes up sometimes, but just little craft kinds of things. Because this game is being a little bit daring. There's a few ways in which it's daring, at least one of which you'll find out if you play more. But one of the ways is this whole nonverbal communication thing that it's doing. It never gives you a single linguistic instruction at all, right? It's totally the opposite of a Nintendo game, right?
Like a modern Nintendo game.
Yeah, a modern Nintendo game. It's more like Legend of Zelda or something, right? Although even that has characters who talk to you.
Right.
Sure.
But I know what you mean.
Yeah, so that you have to make that. It doesn't just work by itself. You have to make it work, and there's a lot of things that we do to make it work. For example, in the art style, and actually, there's going to be a presentation at GDC this year about this, maybe if it gets accepted. There was also sort of one at SIGGRAPH. I don't know if that's online, but we had to do the art style fairly differently from how a lot of games are, because in a lot of games you're just like, I want to make this stuff look really cool, right? So go, right? Here, I was very insistent that people be economical about how they draw people's attention, right? Because if you bring people's attention in the wrong way, toward a red herring that's
you can
not
obsess
relevant,
around over it. Yeah.
Then not only will you maybe think that there's a puzzle there, but it's also taking your attention away from where it needs to be, which ambiently makes everything harder, right? And I think a lot of game designers don't pay enough attention to that. So the way that comes into play in this game is, the art style is very simple. Like, there's not a lot of noisy textures with a lot of heavy lines and things. It's like mostly high contrast colors with simple shapes, simple fields of color, right? And that way we can signal that something should have your attention or not. When we allow something to grab your attention, it's because it's important for gameplay or thematically or both. And if you don't understand that the first time you see it, you will eventually by the end of the game, and then it makes sense, right? And so to do that, we had to curtail a lot of regular artist instincts. So like if an artist makes a random tree, they want that tree to look as cool as possible. Right. And I'd be like, no, make it more boring. Because there's nothing there to do.
Colors. Right.
Yeah. And so right there, I mean, probably if you just think about any game that you play, there's probably a lot of moments where you went up to something to investigate and it wasn't anything, even in an action game or something, right? In a puzzle game, that's way more deadly. So I was just very careful about that, and that's one out of 50 ways that you're paranoid.
Right.
Yeah.
To make sure that the kind of instincts that they'd learned through being people who work on games did not kind of overshadow what the goal was here.
Well, but again, also, it's just to really simplify the statement. It's just doing what's right for this specific game. Like the stuff that I just said would not be exactly that way on the next game.
Sure.
Right. So
speaking of what do you do? Obviously, your final stages of this is out in January, a couple months away. But is your brain already working on what your next project is? Whether that project is big or small or whatever.
Well, I already have another game prototype that I want to do. It's not the design isn't done, but it's very promising and very interesting. It's not a puzzle game, in fact. So that's fun. But I also, for the past year, have been making a new programming language. There's a big series of videos on YouTube where I demo it all the time, and that. that's been a spare time thing, but at some point I want to bring it into more of a full-time thing. So we'll see when and how that's possible.
Is that something that you're using on this project? Or
No.
this is like a long-term goal? Like
programming languages are big, complicated things.
Yeah.
So,
I wasn't sure how far along it was.
What's the application of this?
Well, it's to be a better language than something like C++, which is the game most professional game developers use. Or the people who make bigger games use, right? There are many ways in which C++ is woefully deficient, but it's also a thing that has a lot of inertia, And so it's one of those situations where nobody believes that you could ever stop using it. But of course, eventually people will stop using it because 1,000 years in the future, we're not going to be. At what time does that transition happen?
Sure.
And who's there to pick it up, right?
Those moments of transition are really fascinating. Those have come up in your work before, I would say, like moments of technological shift.
Sure.
What is it that's fascinating about that? And is it? Do you think that that seems to be a thing you're very interested in? These moments of progress. What draws you to that question? And do you think that you're contributing in some way to that, whether through this programming language or through trying to shake off the kind of the chains of pretentious game design or whatever?
Well, I hope so, but often all you can do is hope, right? I mean, you just can do the things that you think are the right thing to do, and then there's all this weather of what's this circumstance of history that's going on outside me that I don't even understand, and you just hope that lines up, I think, and you do your best to make it line up, but you're not completely in control of that.
Yeah.
So
we'll
see. Yeah. And so I'm really, with the programming language project, for example, I'm really enjoying it. I will probably use this language for my own stuff for most of the rest of my life, at least. So that's already a plus if it's any good, for sure. Which it is so far.
And you'll know it really well.
I'll know it really well. And I'll give out the code for free to anyone else who wants to use the language. So, from there, we just have to see. Really.
Great.
Right on.
Any other questions, Jeff?
I have everything I need.
Okay.
All right.
I'm
One last
really
one
looking
for
forward
me.
to checking out the.
What was the last game that you played that did feel? I don't even need to use the word honest. What was the last thing that you played where you were like, this has a thing, this has something? Big or small? I'm not looking for. It can be something I've never heard of.
Well, I'm thinking of several games that aren't out yet. So my friend Mark has this game Miegakure. Have you seen that? It's a 4-dimensional puzzle platformer where it's really in 4 dimensions. It's got this Japanese garden aesthetic, and you swap which dimensions you can view, and that's really interesting. And it's very much about exploring its concept, And actually, a very recently announced game. I think Willie Cheer lives here in New York. I don't know, but Relativity, which has now got renamed Manifold Garden.
Okay, right.
I've only played the beginning of that game so far, but again, it feels like a game that really knows what it wants to do, and just goes straight there and doesn't mess around with other things. So I like that kind of thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate it. I think our fans will be happy to hearing some of what's coming up that they could be
Oh, it's been great.
paying attention to. Thanks so much, Sean.
Right on.
Thanks, Jeff.
For coming by.
Thank you.
Definitely.